Welcome to the Food Startups Podcast. Welcome to episode 27 of the Food Startups Podcast.
Today, we're talking about 5 game changers that you need to know about for doing business in Latin America.
But hey, Danny, slow down, man. You were going to tell me that you're on an exciting trip, weren't you?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I've been in Brazil for the last week. I flew in from the U.S., went straight to a U.S. soccer match to cheer on the team, and have been, settling down, getting to know a little bit of northern Brazil ever since.
Sounds like a great time. How has it been with all of the chaos that comes with adding a bunch of people from all over the world to another country?
Man, that's a great question. I mean, it is really, really difficult. For one, I don't speak Portuguese, and while I do speak Spanish, that can pose problems. I'm of this mentality, and I know a bunch of my other friends share it, that they don't want to even try to learn Portuguese while they're still perfecting their Spanish so that it doesn't confuse them. And so I've basically just been kind of getting into things, but then also relying on friends, on my girlfriend who speaks Portuguese to kind of help me out. And then the logistics have been tough. Recife, a city where we are hanging out in, man, they've got a city of 3 million people and 50 hotels. So there was one day where, we woke up and we figured out that we don't have a room for the day because the cheapest hotel is $300. And, we're kind of taking this a few days at a time. So we're not really planning things out. And, some other folks might do months ahead. So it's been interesting, to say the least.
Wow. Sounds like a cool trip, man. Well, before we get into the main topic, let's talk about a few news articles that we have seen that may be of interest to the listeners. And the first one is really China and coffee.
Yeah, man. China is the land of tea, and they've been trying to cultivate coffee in the south of China. And it's for the domestic consumer market. We've been seeing some pretty interesting things from the news and from other entrepreneurs. Basically, Chinese consumers drink about 5 cups of coffee on average per year. But now some southern provinces folks are drinking about 200 cups, pretty close to the world average of 240. So there's interest in this potentially booming Chinese gourmet coffee market. And, man, that's caught my eyebrow. I think it's definitely on the radar of a few other companies, I would say. No, Matt?
Yeah, so 5 cups a year to 200 cups a year. Wow.
Yeah, that's really impressive, really impressive. I mean, that's an entire, basically imagine an entire industry just appearing out of nowhere, it sounds like. I guarantee you a few years, a few decades to actually get the Chinese coffee culture up to where it might be in the States. But actually, if you check out South Korea, Colombia's biggest coffee chain, Juan Valdez, is slated to open up 50 coffee stores in South Korea because South Koreans love gourmet coffee.
And yeah, Danny, I actually know someone here. She exports coffee from Huila with her family farm, and she had met some people from Spain where they buy Colombian coffee, they roast it in Spain, and then they send it over to China in the specialty coffee market, and they sell it at very, very high prices, like 5-6 times higher, or maybe more than you would pay for it in Colombia.
Incredible. Yeah, I can totally see it because luxury has always been king in China, and if coffee is so new and Colombian coffee has this great brand, then you could easily see people, buying this luxury item for, not just $15, which is what you'll see in the States, but maybe $30, $40, without a doubt.
Yeah, it may have been even higher, but I can tell you it was at least $30 or $40, maybe even as high as 50 or 60. It was ridiculous.
Wow.
Yeah, man. So, dude, you ready to jump into the main topic today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a topic that shows a little bit of our wisdom in doing business in Latin America, and also reveal a little bit more about some of our trials and tribulations. So let's go for it.
I think that's a great way to put it. And let me give you a little background. One of the main reasons that we decided to do this topic was a set of contrasting articles, and yes, they're going to be linked on the website, from Mark Manson and Colin Post. Mark Manson is a popular writer at markmanson.net, and he basically says that, young Americans without a clear path, they should go overseas to work because based on the decline in U.S. job market, et cetera, that's the choice to make. And Colin kind of responded saying he didn't agree because, your market value may not be higher elsewhere. And he also points out that a lot of people, including Mark Manson and myself for the majority of the time that I've been abroad, rely on businesses that are set up in the U.S. and not actually working in that country. Because we find when you work in these emerging markets, it can be a lot lower pay and it can be a lot harder to get in. And there's tons and tons of difficulties that you may not find inside the U.S.
Absolutely. 110%. It all depends on how you enter into these foreign countries, Latin America and Latin America's countries in this case. And, if you're going down to, let's say, Cusco in Peru to become an English teacher, it's going to be difficult. You're not going to be paid a lot. But on the other hand, if you have some experience, maybe in an entrepreneurial background, you could definitely, you can do some damage, right? And so I think that, we can definitely like to examine a little bit of what Mark and Colin say and kind of also relate a little bit of kind of what applies to both situations. What should you be doing if you're the MBA that's getting hired by Coca-Cola in Colombia, or if you're just kind of starting out and, building up a network in a city like Medellin or Bogota?
For sure. And I will say one thing, and that's Americans are consumers. They spend money like no one else. Not having been to China. Maybe China is going to change that. But I think, Danny, that you could agree with me there that Americans love spending money.
That's absolutely right. Absolutely right. 100%.
Well, great. So let's get into the topic, 5 game changers and mistakes in Latin American business.
All right. So number 1, all right, phone and email only is a big no-no. So Matt, what is phone, is phone the best way to communicate with your partners, your sourcers, your, different folks that are going to be instrumental in making your business successful?
Well, I will say it's better than email. I would definitely put email dead last behind text messages and WhatsApp. Email is definitely last, but phone, no, it's not the best, Danny. Phone, there are some problems because one, well, at least in Colombia, cell phone reception may not be that great. It's happened to me. Your accent may be hard for them to understand. And it's just not personal. The number one, and this is probably everywhere, but you got to do face-to-face.
Yeah, 110%, man. Just to elaborate a little bit, I believe that you're not going to be able to solidify a deal a lot of the time on the phone in Latin America. Exactly for the reason that Matt said that. Actually, when people are listening to you and they know that you don't have the same accent they do, they want to listen to you less. And it kind of makes sense. You don't want to take someone so seriously. I think that's why outsourcing, which was a huge craze about 15 years ago with call centers in India popping up everywhere, they didn't work so well because people didn't want to speak to folks that had an accent that wasn't from, the southeast of the United States where they were from. So you want to actually get to face because you're able to communicate and you're able to, have a respectful interaction. And then it's really, really tough to solidify deals, Matt. Is that right? It's hard to close a deal of any sort, not just a sale, but a contract for a packager to produce something or a logistics relationship if you're not able to break bread with them.
Trust is earned face-to-face. That's pretty much it.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, Matt, I want to dig deeper just for a second here. So, we've talked about this before. What's a good way to really, if we have that business lesson down, what's a big way to take advantage of it? Is there anything that you would do if we know that, hey, listen, it's not, maybe it's not worth it to email a company every single day for 2 weeks to try to get a response. And how are you going to use this lesson to your advantage?
Sure. Well, I would say in the initial meet and greet, email and phone, usually a combination, and I usually like to call on the phone and then make sure that they get the email. But, you can start that up. But the phone is just to introduce yourself, and they won't call you back. But use the phone to get that face-to-face. So I guess the rule of thumb is try to get that face-to-face meeting as soon as possible.
Excellent. And you know what? I found that actually in Colombia, it's not that hard to get that first face-to-face meeting. It's just what's the most difficult thing is actually making any progress in the first face-to-face meeting. And so what you want to do is you want to be able to extract good commitments that are also candid commitments face-to-face, kind of develop sort of a roadmap for what you're going to do with your potential partners at that first meeting, and then set up that second face-to-face meeting at that first meeting as well.
Right. And, sometimes logistically you may not be able to have more than one face-to-face meeting. So make sure you get all the big things out there like pricing and negotiation and logistics. Try to get as many of those things done in the face-to-face meeting.
Absolutely. Now, Matt, I think it can be tough sometimes, right? Because you don't want to ask for a quote right away. Let's say, sometimes quotes aren't going to be available right away, but you want to kind of figure out if you're going to be a good partner. And so you want to kind of, I try to do a little bit of testing. I try to ask folks just for previous success stories. I try to ask them, if they're the most expensive or the cheapest company in the market, try to hear from them how they're different from other companies. I think it's really useful to kind of just get some context in that first meeting and kind of hear what those companies have to say about themselves too.
Right. And yeah, you're definitely leading us into the next topic because you're right, Danny. You can be too direct. And number 2 are cultural and body language faux pas. Now, what do I mean by this? What I mean to say that each culture is different, and by your body language, by the way you interact with people, you can offend people and be counterproductive in getting things you want done.
Yeah, huge lesson to know. There are sometimes things you can do that without noticing yourself doing them, you can turn people off. And this applies to Latin America, just as this applies to anywhere in the world. Matt, I know you and I were talking about this example of if you give somebody the OK sign in Brazil, that's kind of like an F off. So, that can be pretty bad.
Thumb and index finger together, and you're like, okay, like that is a pretty vulgar gesture in Brazil. I'm actually linking to a book that I've read called Gestures, Taboos, and Language Around the World. You can buy it on Amazon, and it just talks about all the different body language, faux pas, and customs all over the world. So it's a pretty interesting book to read, and I definitely recommend having it on your Kindle if you travel a lot. Now, along those lines, when we talk about those things, there's just like a lot of things with your body language and the culture. Like in Latin America, it's slow. If you're too direct, you're going to kind of offend people. They're going to see you as the typical American robot who only thinks about money and they don't care about family and connecting with people. So you're going to need to connect with them. If you're a male, you're going to need to learn how to hug because Latin men like giving each other hugs. This is something I've had to work on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that might take you out of your comfort zone for a while. And so you got to get ready for it. You got to get ready for it so you can try to, do it naturally. And, after a while, after a few hugging it out, you'll get the hang of it. Right now, a few other things I want to talk about. Actually, I'm going to bring it over to Medellin for a second because that's where I live. And in Medellin, really, some surprising things about the culture and body language is that Medellin's always been the city of merchants. And merchants are always trying to sell their wares at the highest price possible and get the best deal. And so what happens is actually there's a huge culture of, overconfidence where basically you always have to look somebody in the face and really act super confident even if you don't know the answer. And so knowing that you're able to kind of, it took me a while to actually get accustomed to that, but I kind of have to put that on in the sense that my personal style is I try to be very cool and even. But I've seen that this overconfidence is something that people expect and people respond to it. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll say things very kind of boldly, and I'll say them very succinctly as well, because also the more that I talk in Spanish, the more mistakes that I'll make. So I'll keep things really short, and then I'll let the other person respond and make decisions themselves. I found that really, really works well for me, and that's for getting things done specifically in Medellin.
Right on. And I just want to say one more thing about culture and body language, etc., is when you're communicating with people, you may have to realize that it's not just all about the money. There are more important things. I'm not saying that in the U.S. it's all about the money, but it sure holds a higher importance in general on the list of things when you're trying to connect with the company that you're trying to purchase something from or sell something to.
Absolutely, absolutely. When people see that money is the only thing on your mind, then they can actually get pretty turned off by it in Colombia. And, Colombia specifically is a pretty interesting case because Colombia is a big fan of the United States, and Colombians in general are a big fan of kind of the most popular American brands and capitalism in general. But at the same time, there's this reputation of the American that wants to just get rich quick in Colombia and, overpromises all these things and then doesn't really deliver. And so people always want to know that you're serious. And so they want to know that you're serious, but they also want to know that you're kind of in it for the long run.
Right. And I think that's another segue, Danny. Good job. On our third game changer, it's trust. And this goes both ways. We just talk a lot about earning trust through cultural norms and body language, but you can't take things for granted, and you can't overtrust other people.
Trust and taking things for granted, Matt, is such an important topic because in Latin America, you have to really be in charge of every single step in any sort of transaction you do until you've done it once, maybe done it twice, done it a few times so that you can kind of take a step back. And that means that, at the last step of a business deal, if you're not looking over the contracts, you might miss some really important details. And they particularly apply. I particularly feel or hear the stories of people just kind of, missing out on big opportunities or losing big investments simply because they haven't really fostered the process of what they're doing every single step along the way.
Yeah, man, I can't stress that enough, that you have to double check and follow up on everything. And when someone says, yeah, I got this, or I can do this, maybe they can, but they may not know the steps involved. And, if you're buying a bunch of food that you're going to export to the U.S. and they tell you they have the permits to export, but they don't, well, that's your fault because you didn't follow up and make sure and confirm that they actually had them.
Yeah, and this is, this is something that's a pretty important topic, I think. Matt, listen, check this out. So I love when I get together with another food entrepreneur or a potential partner, like a packager or someone who's going to bring me raw ingredients. And we talk about our shared interests and we can get excited about them. I love that, right? But then at the same time, it has to translate over to the business side. And so when you've got all this goodwill that you foster just through, really, one, liking your partners, and two, trying to build these relationships, you have to move that over to what's official and what's actually going to work, which is, listen, if someone's telling you that they've exported before, ask them about it and understand, what they've really done, understand the quantities in which they've exported. If they say they're ready to export, then you really, really want to kind of narrow in and zero in on what have they done and what haven't they done. Sometimes it's hard to ask those difficult questions, in my opinion. And I don't know. I mean, there are various ways to handle it. What are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, Danny, and just on the export one alone. So, I've had experience where I've worked with companies where they say they have exported before, and yes, that's true, but they didn't directly export. In Colombia, there's a big thing about being the direct exporter or having your product shipped with a CI, which I think is a Comercializadora Internacional, that kind of consolidates your shipments for you and sends them out, because those are different things in terms of the paperwork. And I've realized that one of my suppliers had exported indirectly, but they had never directly exported. So you have to be very specific. And another thing that comes down to trust is one thing they have in Colombia is something called la malicia indígena, which means just like an inherent distrust of other people. Now that sounds horrible, but just so you know, Colombia is one of the leading countries in terms of like falsification of documents and things like that in the world. I'm not saying that they're bad people or anything like that, but I would be a little bit more skeptical in Colombia than I would be in the U.S. Does that make sense, Danny?
Yeah, I think you're kind of right on, and that kind of relates to how this is another thing that's a little bit off topic, but often when one business finds success in Colombia in the domestic market, you find 10 different copycats sprouting up, and that just happens because of the fact that people think that, you know, everything that you've done is fair game. And they kind of want to, it's less of a win-win attitude that you might find in some other countries. I'm not really sure. And so sometimes you can encounter that. And it's kind of in line with what La Malicia Indígena is from what I understand. Okay. And I want to say, you know, listen, I'm not an expert in this, but I think it's very wise to be a little bit wary and to really just do your diligence, as you said. One extra thing that I do is I oftentimes will tell folks that I work with, well, listen, you know, I need you to get some information for me. And it's important you get it for me because my auditing department will need it before anything is done. And not just because if it's me, their friend, asking them to send it over to me, but if it's a deal breaker because of some compliance issues, then they're really going to get it over to me about 10 times quicker from what I've found. And, you know, and that way you can kind of, you know, if you don't have an auditing department set up, well, you should pretend like you do, because down the line you will. You know, if you keep on thinking big and, you know, taking the right steps, you will. So I don't think it's anything that's also kind of dishonest in any way.
Right on. Well, we will definitely come back to trust in future episodes because this is just incredibly important in all different parts of the supply chain, including your customer. Maybe even most important. Now, moving on, we have a quick one here, and it's more like a pep talk, but it's really true. Don't give up.
Absolutely. You can't underestimate what persistence means in doing business in Latin America, especially in an industry where, in a business-to-business industry, not a business-to-consumer industry, where deals have really long sales cycles and, you know, things just are slow. So I think that what you want to do, and I don't know, Matt, I think that you've really become a strong force to be reckoned with in Bogota, where you really try to make strong ties across multiple verticals, right? Maybe you could comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, Danny, I appreciate those words. So I would say that, yeah, I've made a lot of strong bonds and I've met a lot of people. I've done a pretty good job of networking here. And I didn't really try to do networking. It was kind of a secondary effect of meeting the people that I thought I needed to know. But yeah, I think building that up and getting that persistence, one thing you find from very successful people is they stuck with it. They hung around. It's nothing quick. And just knowing that and being a little bit more gritty. I don't know. I feel like I'm more gritty now than when we even started this podcast, and knowing that's not an overnight thing and being willing to just hang around and fight your way through these things, even though the processes always take longer than you thought it would take.
Absolutely. You need to hang in there because sometimes you receive gifts. Sometimes opportunities present themselves out of nowhere. And also sometimes potential opportunities that went away before, you find another route to them. And that's how things work a lot in Latin America, where if you don't know the right decision maker, nothing gets done. And sometimes the right decision maker presents themselves to you in a random way. What we're here to do from our side is to actually pass those learnings on to you as well. So we'll make the mistakes and we'll pay the money from our pocket, and you guys, the listeners, will be able to make sure that you're a little bit stronger when you guys start off.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure there's a list of 5 to 10 tips that could have saved me a lot of time and money. But to be fair, there's a lot of things that I had to learn on my own because they're individual situations that catch-all advice can not help you with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So our last game changer we call minimum viable company. And what that means is that if you have an idea that you can find a customer for your startup company that might be willing to buy your ingredients, or it might be a big distributor or supermarket chain, you really need to know what their specifications are early on. And if you don't know what they are early on, what might happen is you might get 95% of the way there, and then you might get rejected at the end simply because you haven't done your diligence. And this kind of example doesn't just apply to having a company, I guess, but also applies to, living in a country, knowing your visa situation, or, kind of knowing how things work. If you don't know the lay of the land, then at some point you're going to make a big mistake that might just kind of compromise everything you've been working on.
Yeah, and Dan, let me see if I can give a few examples to help clarify what we're talking about here. So let's just say you're working on a product and you have this new product launch that you want to take from Latin America and bring it to the U.S. for this new superfood. And you find that you get the packaging, you get a great supplier, they seem really friendly, they have a good price, and you find the day that after you've gotten everything together and you're ready to export, that this company doesn't really have that USDA organic certification that you need to be competitive in the market. It's a semi-organic product, because I say semi-organic because I've had people come to me saying, we have a kind of organic product, right? Or we have something that we say is organic, but it's just by our word. We have no way to prove that. So you've put all this work into it, but you didn't realize the bottleneck was you need the USDA organic certification.
Absolutely. That's huge. And then, there are tons of these types of examples. Another one might just be that sometimes what you're trying to export, actually, you're not allowed to import into, your target country. If it's the United States, there are specific foods that are not allowed to be imported simply because of restrictions, because of different types of bacteria or different types of sicknesses that these foods might bring in. And maybe you've spent 6 or 9 months just trying to figure it out before kind of finding out that last piece and then seeing that the deal is not going to get done.
Maybe in the future, if you want to look for those bottlenecks, what could completely ruin this operation, and try to brainstorm for that, even though it sounds counterproductive in the very beginning, just to make sure you don't have any huge red flags that could prevent the project from having success.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a little more complicated than, starting up a tech business or having a niche business, as we've talked about on the podcast, because a lot of the barriers to entry in those businesses are just so low. You can just produce content online, or once you have a payment processor in place, you're good to go. But with something like this, you have to think about it in terms of manufacturing. So what I would say is it's kind of like, imagine that you have to fit a bunch of different pieces of luggage into the trunk of a car, and you find that you're actually trying to fit the biggest piece in last. And you know that it's not going to actually fit in because you have these other things arranged differently. What you want to do is you want to take care of fitting that biggest piece in first and then work around everything. In that way, you can actually make sure that you can, catch the early mistakes, catch the biggest mistakes you can make early on, and then find success later in the path.
So great. So Danny, we covered those 5 game changers in Latin American business, and we'd actually love to hear from anybody. Did you have any different opinions? Maybe you experienced things differently than we did, and that's great. We're trying to build the most accurate perception possible based on our experience and the experience of our listeners.
Absolutely. And, things vary from country to country. So we're definitely trying to get our experience as our businesses grow, doing business in other countries in Latin America. And that's going to give us even more context. But you guys can also help us understand what it's like firsthand.
Right on. All right, guys. Well, thanks for hanging around for this World Cup episode, and we will see you next week.
All right. Awesome.
Thanks so much for listening. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, find us online at foodstartupspodcast.com.